They had nothing left to lose. But first, remember to stay tuned because today we're going to talk about a civil war, and not just any civil war, but perhaps the most important one in modern history, the American Civil War. Let's go back to the beginning, shall we? The year is 1860. You are in a small town. Life is good, business is booming, and everything seems to be going well. Then suddenly a man named Abraham Lincoln comes along who wants to end slavery. Everyone in the South is freaking out right now. They do not want slavery to be abolished. In fact, they love having slaves. It makes their lives so much easier. Imagine if someone came along and said, "Hey, you can't have your pet monkey anymore." You would probably freak out too. And these Southerners were no different. Now, there was already tension between the North and the South prior to Mr. Lincoln coming along. See, the North had a bunch of industrial cities which had a lot of immigrants living there, while the South was more rural and based their economy around growing cotton and having slaves pick it. Because of this, the North and the South became very different from each other. Like, imagine if California and Maine suddenly started acting very differently from each other. It'd be pretty weird. And that's exactly what was happening here. Over time, people began to think that maybe the North and the South should just break up and become their own separate countries. The Northerners didn't want to do this, though, since they thought that breaking up the country would lead to chaos. Plus, they didn't want those dirty, smelly, incestuous rednecks from the South taking over the country. So they put up a big fight when the Southern states threatened to secede from the Union. Then came Mr. Lincoln, a man who won the presidency by promising to keep the country together. The South hated him for this, and when he took office, 11 Southern states left the Union and formed their own country called the Confederate States of America. The capital was in Richmond, Virginia. Now, before we continue, let me show you something really cool. This is a map of the world during this time period. As you can see, Europe is completely boned. They lost all of their colonies in the Americas. Not only that, but they also lost most of their power over the seas. England was still a major world power, but its power was beginning to diminish. Meanwhile, the United States was on the rise, and this was extremely unsettling to Europeans. The old world order was crumbling, and there was nothing they could do about it. They were simply too weak. Anyway, back to the video. Now that the South had their own country, Mr. Lincoln was faced with a tough decision. Should he fight to keep the country together or just let the South go? Well, after much deliberation, he decided to fight. Mainly because he didn't want future presidents to be like, "Hey, let's break up the country some more." That would have been very bad. So he gathered up his troops and headed down to the South to kick some ass. The first shots of the war were fired at Fort Sumter, and that's where we begin our story. Things are looking grim for the Union soldiers inside the fort. They have almost run out of food and supplies, and they are being constantly bombarded by the Confederates. Just as things are looking their bleakest, though, a Union boat shows up and begins bringing them food and supplies. It was an attempt to resupply the fort and hopefully get the soldiers to hold out a little longer. Suddenly, a group of soldiers pop up behind the trees and open fire on the boat. "What the hell?" yells Private Johnson, a Union soldier. "Who's there?" One of the soldiers puts his gun down and calmly replies, "It's me, John Wilkes Booth." Private Johnson and the rest of the soldiers are confused. John Wilkes Booth was a famous actor from Washington, D.C., and he wasn't supposed to be here. Before anyone can figure out what's going on, though, Booth opens fire and hits Private Johnson right in the chest. "I'm sorry, Johnson," says Booth, "but I have to do this. My country comes first." Booth then turns to the other soldiers and repeats the same line. "I'm sorry, but my country comes first." As the soldiers fall to the ground, dead, Booth runs into the fort. He finds Captain Anderson, the leader of the Union soldiers, and tells him, "It's over, Anderson. Give up." Anderson looks at Booth and replies, "Never." Booth pulls out his gun and shoots Anderson right in the head. Anderson falls to the ground, dead. Booth then turns to the rest of the soldiers and gives them the same choice: surrender or die. The soldiers look at each other and then at their guns. They don't want to surrender, but they also don't want to die. So they do the unthinkable. They lay down their guns and raise their hands in surrender. Booth smiles and says, "Good, now you will help me take over the fort." Booth and his men quickly take over the fort and find the treasure room. Inside, they find a chest full of gold coins. "We have to move this stuff somewhere safe," says Booth. "My men and I will take it back to Richmond." As they load the treasure onto their wagons, a Union soldier named Thomas Dixon sneaks up on them and stabs one of the Confederate soldiers in the back. "You dirty animal, you'll pay for that," says Booth, pulling out his gun. Dixon grabs the nearest wagon wheel and uses it to shield himself from the gunfire. "Shoot me, Booth," says Dixon. "I'd rather die than let you win." Booth hesitates, then puts his gun down. He knows he can't win against a wagon wheel, so he gives up and walks away. As he walks away, he hears the sound of cannons. He looks back and sees that the Union has sent reinforcements. "Damn," he says, "I guess it's time to go." Booth and his men jump on their horses and ride away as fast as they can. They know they can't win against the Union, so they've decided to retreat. But wait, what happened to all the gold? Well, it's still there, sitting in the fort, collecting dust. That is, until Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederacy, comes along. He sees the gold and figures he might as well use it to fund the war effort. So he does. He uses the gold to buy weapons and ammunition, and that helps the Confederacy fight the Union for a little while longer. Eventually, though, the Confederacy loses the war, and the United States becomes a stronger country because of it. In fact, many historians believe that the Civil War was one of the most important events in US history. If the South had won, the country might not have become the superpower it is today. Meanwhile, the world begins to shift once again. The United States is rising in power, but it's not alone. Japan is also becoming more powerful by the day. In fact, it will soon become an empire stretching from Korea to Russia. And speaking of Russia, they're also getting stronger. They're modernizing their army and navy and preparing themselves for the inevitable showdown with the British. Oh, and did I mention that the French are also trying to build an empire in Africa? Anyway, back to the video. Now that the United States had dealt with a pesky little rebellion, it was time to set its sights on something new: world domination. Of course, that's just a joke, but it's also not entirely true. The United States did begin to expand its influence around the world after the Civil War, but that's a story for another time. Today, we're going to focus on how the war changed the United States forever. First off, slavery was finally abolished in the United States. This led to many Southerners leaving the Democratic Party and joining the Republican Party instead. That's because the Republicans were the ones who fought to end slavery. Second, the United States became a lot more industrialized during the war. That's because the North had more factories and machines than the South. With the end of the war, the North became even more industrialized, and that led to more jobs and economic growth. Third, the United States became a lot more urban during the war. That's because many Southerners fled to the cities to escape the fighting. After the war ended, though, many of them stayed in the cities, and that led to rapid urbanization. Fourth, the United States became a lot more nationalistic during the war. That's because the fighting brought the country together in a way. Both sides were fighting for the soul of the nation, and that led to a sense of unity. Fifth, the United States became a lot more militaristic after the war. That's because the country had just gone through a bloody civil war, and that made people think that war was the best way to solve problems. So there you have it, a brief overview of the American Civil War. It was a time of great change for the United States, and it set the stage for the country's rise to world power. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more awesome videos.